Don't take that road! The spillway's opening in 20 minutes!
Girl, you trying to get run over?
The gates. Somebody's opening them tonight. That low bridge floods before you're halfway across.
Move it. We got a deadline.
The rig rolled forward anyway, tires hissing through a puddle already crawling across the blacktop.
Y'all seen this before? Homeless girl runs out yelling about floods and the sheriff's 10 minutes behind picking up the pieces.
20 years old. No shoes, a canvas coat 2 sizes too big, buttoned wrong. Odessa Renfro hadn't eaten since church that morning, and she'd run 3 miles barefoot down a levee road to catch this convoy. 10 trucks passed her by. Then, at the very back of the line, an engine cut out. A door creaked open. Whatever happens next on this road decides who makes it home by sunrise, and who never should have doubted her. Subscribe right now. Tell me where you're listening from. Let's go back to the second before that door opened. Headlights swung around the bend at Coldwater Landing and caught her standing dead center in the lane, arms out, barefoot on wet asphalt. The lead rig's air brakes screamed, "Don't take that road. The spillway's opening in 20 minutes." The horn answered her instead of a voice, a blast so loud it rattled the cypress trees along the shoulder. A door popped open above her. "Girl, you trying to get run over?" "The gates. Somebody's opening them tonight. That low bridge floods before you're halfway across." "Move it. We got a deadline." The rig rolled forward anyway, tires hissing through a puddle already crawling across the blacktop. She held her ground until the bumper was close enough to feel the heat off the engine, then stepped aside at the last second, chest heaving, water soaking up through the cuffs of her jeans. 20 years old, no shoes, a canvas coat 2 sizes too big, buttoned wrong. She hadn't eaten since the church breakfast that morning, and she'd run 3 miles down the levee road to catch this convoy before it turned onto Highway 990. Behind the lead truck, 10 more idled in a long chrome line, stretching back toward the parish line, headlights swallowed by fog rolling off the Atchafalaya. 11 rigs, 11 drivers who didn't know her name and had no reason to trust it. The second truck slowed. A woman leaned out the window, 60-some years of river wind carved into her face. "Y'all seen this before? Homeless girl runs out yelling about floods, and the sheriff's 10 minutes behind picking up the pieces." She spat toward the shoulder and rolled the window back up. The truck kept moving, and the third one closed the gap behind it before Odessa could even reach the yellow line. "Please," her voice cracked on the word, and she hated that it did. "Somebody has to hear this." Nobody did. The third truck's driver stared straight ahead, hands locked at 10 and 2, eyes fixed on some point past the windshield that let him pretend he hadn't seen her at all. The fourth truck's high beams caught her full in the face, and she froze for half a second in the middle of the road before her legs remembered to move. If you're the kind of person who'd still stop for someone like her, even after 9 trucks in a row didn't, hit subscribe right now, because in about 90 seconds one man on this convoy is going to do exactly that, and you don't want to miss the moment it happens. She kept walking the line, grills taller than she was, diesel heat rolling off idling engines in waves that fogged against the cold coming off the water. A man in the 5th truck laughed at something on his radio and didn't glance down once. In the 6th, a driver reached for his phone, thumb already scrolling, something to wait out rather than something happening. Nobody in Plaquemine had ever believed a word out of her mouth. Not the sheriff's office, not the church, not the woman at the grocery store who'd once told her to keep moving before she scared off paying customers. She'd learned the shape disbelief took before it even opened its mouth. The windows rolling up, the eyes sliding past her without ever once landing on her. She'd overheard it 2 nights earlier, curled behind a stack of pallets outside the Bayou Crest construction trailer, close enough to hear a man's voice say auxiliary gates, and tonight without a hint of weight behind either word. She didn't know yet whose lives that water would decide. She only knew the convoy was still rolling toward that bridge, and behind her, the fog over the low road was thickening by the minute, curling low across the blacktop ahead of the water that was about to follow it. The 7th and 8th trucks passed without slowing. In the 9th, a young driver actually met her eyes for a moment, his foot easing off the gas by a fraction. Then he caught himself and looked away first, pressing back down. 10 trucks gone, 1 left. She kept moving anyway, arms wrapped tight around herself now, jaw set, refusing to let her legs stop even as the lead rig's blinker clicked on far ahead, steady and patient, already signaling the turn onto 990, the turn that would put 11 men on a bridge that wouldn't exist in 20 minutes. The last truck in line hadn't moved, its engine cut out. The sudden silence hit harder than any horn had all night. Odessa stopped walking. Somewhere ahead, that blinker kept ticking, counting down a turn nobody on this road had any business making. Behind her, a door creaked open. The door of the last truck creaked wider, but nobody stepped down yet. Odessa stood frozen in the gap between headlights and dark, her breath fogging in front of her, close enough now to smell diesel and rain on hot metal. She thought of her grandmother's voice, the only steady thing 3 years of sleeping outside hadn't managed to take from her. Tell the truth even when your hands are shaking. 2 sentences, no more, and then the memory let go of her the way it always did. Fast, before it could turn into something she'd have to sit with. Her hands were shaking. She told the truth anyway. "I sleep under the old boat ramp," she said, loud enough to carry into the cab, though she wasn't sure yet if anyone was listening. 200 yards from where they keep the gate controls. I've watched that crew move equipment for a month. Tonight they moved the switchbox out to the levee itself. That's new. That's not routine. Nobody answered. The silence stretched long enough that she almost turned to keep walking, back toward the fog, back toward whatever she'd tell herself once 11 trucks disappeared around the bend without her. She had nothing to back any of it up. No phone, no ID, no number to call that would put a badge between her and the water. What she had was 2 nights of watching a construction trailer from behind a stack of pallets, and a man's voice on a phone call, flat and certain, laying out a release schedule down to the minute, indifferent to who made it home and who didn't. She'd run 3 miles on that alone. 3 miles barefoot down a levee road slick with rain, past the shelter in Colton that had turned her away in October, past the church that had fed her that morning and nothing more. Because somewhere between the pallets and the road she'd understood something simple. If she didn't say it out loud to somebody, 11 men were going to drive into water they couldn't see coming, and she'd be the only living person who knew why. If you've ever known something was wrong before anyone else believed you, you already understand why she kept walking instead of turning back. And if that's you, hit subscribe now, because what this one driver does next is the reason this story is still being told. The boat ramp had been home for 3 weeks now, ever since the last shelter bed in the parish filled up and stayed full. Before that, she'd tried the church on 5th Street, where a deacon told her the pews weren't for sleeping, and to try again come Sunday. She hadn't gone back. A concrete slab under a corrugated overhang wasn't much, but nobody there told her to leave. She'd learned the schedule of the Bayou Crest crew, the way other people learn a job. Which trucks came at dawn, which men smoked by the water at lunch, which nights the site manager stayed late on the phone with someone he called Sir. She'd learned it because there was nothing else to do under a boat ramp at 2 a.m. except listen, and because watching had become the only kind of work this town had left for her to do. Tonight the listening had turned into something else. A decision. A 3-mile run in bare feet over gravel and broken asphalt, her lungs burning, her only thought the 11 sets of headlights she needed to catch before they turned. She'd caught them. 10 trucks had already answered her the only way this town ever answered her. With silence, with locked windows, with an engine that just kept running. The 11th hadn't moved yet. A boot came down onto the wet asphalt, slow and deliberate, the kind of step that belonged to a man used to trusting his own weight before he trusted anything else. Then a second door opened behind him. A third. Up and down the line, engines that had been idling past her for the last 10 minutes started cutting out one by one, until the only sound left on Highway 990 was boots on wet blacktop and the low mechanical hum carrying up from the direction of the spillway. Odessa's chest tightened. 10 trucks that hadn't stopped for her were stopping now, not because of anything she'd said in the last 30 seconds, but because the last man in line hadn't driven away. 11 sets of eyes were about to be on her at once, all at the same time, and she had no idea yet whether that was rescue or just a bigger audience for the same old verdict. Gil Renner reached her first, a big man in a canvas vest, arms already crossed before his boots fully settled on the asphalt. 2 more drivers fell in behind him, one still chewing something from a gas station bag, the other rubbing sleep out of his eyes, scowling at having to be awake for this. "Ma'am, no disrespect," Gil said, But we've got a resort waiting on steel trusses and 2 generators, and a schedule that don't care about a feeling you had in the dark. I don't have a feeling. Odessa held his eyes. I have a name. Roland Vachon. He owns Bayou Crest. He told his foreman the gates open at 2:40, right when your convoy's supposed to hit the low bridge. The driver with the gas station bag snorted, crumpling the wrapper in his fist. 2:40. She's got the time down to the minute. That's real convincing, sweetheart. Y'all heard about her, right? The sleepy one said, not bothering to lower his voice. Parish office had a whole file on this one. Girl talks to herself down by the water half the night. Sheriff's been out there twice this month alone. I'm not talking to myself. Odessa's jaw tightened, but her voice didn't rise to meet his. I'm telling you what I heard a man say on a phone call 2 nights ago, standing 10 feet from where he said it. A 4th driver climbed down to join the others, older, heavier, wiping his hands on a rag he didn't need. This the same girl chased out of the Piggly Wiggly last spring? Mrs. Doiron still tells that story. He said it to Gil, not to her. The way people talk about someone instead of to them, when they've already decided the conversation doesn't require her opinion. Sure you did. Gil shook his head, already half turning back toward his cab. Look, I get it. Rough night, rough life, whatever it is. But we're not rerouting 11 trucks off a schedule because somebody sleeping outside had a bad dream about a bridge. It's not a dream. She stepped toward him, closing the distance until there was nowhere left for him to look but at her. You cross that bridge in 20 minutes. You're driving into 6 feet of current with nowhere to turn a rig around. I've watched that crew move equipment for a month. I know what I saw. Nobody answered her. The gas station driver laughed under his breath, low enough to pretend it wasn't meant for her to hear, loud enough that it landed anyway. At the very back of the small crowd forming around her, Roscoe Pruitt stood with his hands loose at his sides, not laughing, not shaking his head, not reaching for his door to climb back in. His eyes stayed on her the whole time, steady, unreadable, weighing whether what she'd said could be trusted before he decided to act on it. Gil caught the silence and misread it for agreement. Roscoe, back me up here. We can't be losing 40 minutes over. 2:40, Roscoe said, cutting him off without raising his voice at all. Gil blinked. What? You said she's got the time down to the minute, like that's a mark against her. Roscoe hadn't moved from where he stood, hadn't looked away from Odessa once. Man lying to cover himself gives you a guess. A vague hour. Somewhere around dark, somewhere before dawn. She gave you a minute. Nobody laughed this time. The sleepy driver's mouth stayed half open around whatever he'd been about to say next, and swallowed it instead. Roscoe took one step forward, then another, until he was close enough that Odessa had to tilt her head back to hold his eyes. His voice, when it came, wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Say that again, he said, slower. Every driver on that stretch of blacktop turned toward him instead of her, because his silence had just become the loudest thing in the parking lot. From the top, Roscoe said, not for them, for me. Odessa took a breath and started over, steadier this time, finally speaking to someone worth being precise for. The gates on the east spillway, there's 6 of them. I've watched that crew work for a month from the boat ramp, close enough to see which ones they test and which ones they never touch. 2 nights ago I was behind the pallets outside the construction trailer when I heard Vachon's foreman on the phone with him directly. Vachon gave the order himself. Roscoe's thumb stopped moving against the side of his phone at the name. One small motion cut off mid-stroke, gone as fast as it started, there and folded away again before anyone but Odessa could have caught it. Say the name again, he said, flat, giving nothing back. Vachon. Roland Vachon. He said tonight. He said a number after it, and I didn't understand the number then. I understand it now. 2:40. How do you know which switch does what? Because I sleep 200 yards from the box that controls them. I've had a month of nights with nothing to do but watch which lever a man's hand goes to before the water starts moving. She held his stare. I'm not guessing which gates. I'm telling you which ones. You said a padlock. Was it locked when you saw it, or open? The question caught her off guard, precise in a way none of the others had been. Locked. Every night I've watched. It's been locked. A real padlock. The kind you need a key for, not a latch. She paused, working back through the last 2 nights in her head, except the night I heard the phone call. That night it was already hanging open on the hasp when I came back to check. I thought I'd just misremembered it. I didn't think about it again until now. Tonight's a Tuesday, Roscoe said, half to himself, and something in the way he said it told her the detail mattered more than she understood yet. Gil shifted his weight behind Roscoe, arms still crossed, jaw working, weighing a decision he clearly didn't want to make. Roscoe, we've got a 4 a.m. delivery window at Bayou Crest. Every 20 minutes we lose here is 20 minutes we're explaining to a client tomorrow. Then you'll explain it, Roscoe said, not turning around. That's not... Gil started. Ezra. Roscoe's voice cut clean through him. Get your kit. A wiry man near the middle of the convoy straightened up from where he'd been leaning against his cab, flashlight already coming out of a side pocket, before Roscoe had even finished the order. Ezra Duplantis didn't ask what for, he just started walking. Gil tried once more, quieter now, the argument already sounding lost even to him, said out loud, only because his conscience needed to hear it. We check a shed, we lose the window, we lose the window, we lose the contract. We drive across that bridge blind, we lose 11 trucks and however many of us are in them. Roscoe finally turned to face him fully. I'm not asking you to believe her, Gil. I'm asking you to give me 15 minutes to find out if she's right, before we bet our lives she's wrong. Nobody argued after that. If you've ever needed just one person to take 15 minutes and actually check before writing you off, this next part is for you. Hit subscribe now, because what they find at that shed is about to change everything this convoy thought they knew about tonight. Roscoe started down the access path toward the levee, without waiting to see who followed. Odessa fell in beside him, and Ezra came up on her other side, flashlight beam cutting a narrow tunnel through the fog ahead of them. Behind them, the convoy sat idling in the dark, 11 sets of headlights aimed at nothing, waiting. Roscoe didn't speak again for a long stretch of the walk. It wasn't the silence of a man thinking about logistics. Ezra glanced at him twice and said nothing, because in 6 years of driving for Pruitt Freight, he'd never once seen his boss go quiet like that. Jaw tight, eyes fixed somewhere past the tree line, held on something that wasn't there anymore, or something that had never fully left. The mechanical hum from the spillway grew louder with every step they took toward the trees, low and steady, the sound of gates that hadn't opened yet, but were already counting down. The shed sat exactly where Odessa said it would, a cinder block box half swallowed by brush at the base of the levee, its tin roof beaded with rain. The padlock hung open on the hasp, swinging slightly in the wind. Around the door, boot prints pressed into the mud were still filling with water, too fresh to have been there more than an hour. Ezra crouched and swept his flashlight low across the ground before he touched anything. Multiple sets, big tread, work boots. Somebody's been in and out of here more than once tonight. Roscoe pushed the door open with 2 fingers, careful not to disturb the frame. Inside, a bank of switches glowed dull green under a hand-lettered sign that read Auto. One switch, third from the left, had been flipped to a position labeled Remote, a thin cable running from a port beneath it, out through a gap chewed in the wall, and off into the dark toward the tree line. This isn't storm protocol, Ezra said, crouched by the panel now, multimeter in one hand. Storm protocol's automated straight from the parish emergency office. It doesn't run through a cable somebody dragged out here by hand. He followed the wire with his flashlight until the beam caught the shape of a pickup parked deep in the trees. Engine off, a laptop glowing faintly through the windshield. Somebody's running these gates off a phone connection out of the back of that truck. Odessa stood in the doorway, arms wrapped around herself, watching 2 men treat what she'd said like it was simply true, not a story to be managed, not a symptom to be diagnosed, just information they were now acting on. Nobody had done that in 3 years. The switch, she said quietly, that's the one he had his hand on the day I saw the wire moved for the first time. I didn't know what it did, I just knew it wasn't there before. Roscoe pulled out his phone and started photographing the panel. The switch position, the cable, the timestamp stamped automatically in the corner of each shot. Then the boot prints outside, then the gap in the wall. He worked fast and said little, building the case file a courtroom would need someday, not just tonight. Get the serial plate too, he told Ezra, and the padlock. I wanted on record that this was open, not forced. Somebody with a key did this. Ezra photographed the lock from 3 angles, then crouched again by the cable running out through the wall, tracing it with 2 fingers without touching the copper. This wasn't installed by anybody on the parish payroll. Look at the splice job. Hand-soldered, no conduit, no permit sticker. Whoever ran this didn't want an inspector finding it during daylight. Ezra swept the light across the panel a second time, slower now, checking his own work. Near the bottom edge, half hidden behind a coil of extra cable, a printed release schedule was taped to the metal, Bayou Crest letterhead across the top, a signature scrawled at the bottom of the page. He leaned in, and the flashlight beam froze on it, his hand no longer moving. Roscoe. His voice had changed. You need to see this. Roscoe crossed the shed in 2 steps and photographed the page like everything else. Flat, methodical, the same clipped focus he'd given the switch and the cable and the boot prints. If the name at the bottom of that schedule meant anything to him, he didn't let it show. He read it once, logged it, and moved on to the next thing that needed documenting. That's evidence, he said, already turning back toward the door. Bag it if you can, photograph it either way. I'm calling it in, he said, thumb already moving across the screen. Parish emergency line. If this schedule's real, we need somebody with authority to shut those gates down before we do anything else. Ezra glanced at Odessa, then back at the signature still taped to the panel, and said nothing. Outside, the mechanical hum from deeper in the spillway ticked up half a register, like something in the system had just registered a change in schedule. Roscoe held the phone to his ear. It rang once, twice. Then a voice picked up on the other end, calm and immediate, the way people answer when they've been waiting for a call, rather than caught off guard by one. The line picked up on the second ring, faster than any government office had ever answered Roscoe in his life. Iberville Parish Emergency Management. This is Denise Arsenault. Ms. Arsenault, this is Roscoe Pruitt. Pruitt Freight Lines. I've got 11 trucks stopped short of Coldwater Bend. We found a control shed on the east spillway rigged to a remote switch, a cable running out to a truck in the trees, and a release schedule with Bayou Crest letterhead sitting on top of the panel. Mr. Pruitt, I appreciate the concern. Her voice stayed level and unhurried, an answer that sounded rehearsed long before he'd ever called. That's a scheduled controlled release. Standard procedure this time of year, given the rainfall totals we've been tracking. Standard procedure doesn't come with a laptop hidden in the woods, Ms. Arsenault. A pause, half a second too long for someone with nothing to think about. I'll have someone look into it in the morning. There won't be a bridge in the morning. Then I'd suggest you reroute, Mr. Pruitt. The line went dead before he could ask the question sitting right behind his teeth. How a parish director he'd never spoken to in his life already knew his name, his company, and exactly which convoy was calling her at this hour. Roscoe lowered the phone slowly. Behind him, the mechanical hum from the spillway ticked up another half register, steady as a countdown nobody else could hear yet. Gil, who'd caught up to them at the shed a few minutes earlier, against every instinct that told him to stay with his truck, said what the rest of them were only starting to think. She's in on it. Nobody argued with him this time. If a phone call has ever told you more by what it refused to say than by anything in it, you already understand this moment. Hit subscribe now, because Roscoe's about to find the one detail that changes who he thinks is actually behind tonight. Roscoe didn't answer Gil right away. He pulled up his phone again, not to call anyone this time, but to open the dispatch app that tracked every route Pruitt Freight Lines had assigned that week. He scrolled backward 2 days, past deliveries he barely remembered approving, until he found tonight's run. He stopped scrolling. The route hadn't come from him. He was the owner. Every long haul over 400 miles crossed his desk before it went to a driver, had for 30 years, because that was the one rule his father had drilled into him before handing over the company. This route, 11 trucks, Highway 990, Coldwater Bend, had been entered 2 days ago, assigned directly to dispatch, and approved under a login that wasn't his. He tapped the entry, scrolling through the changelog line by line. Timestamp, route number, a dispatcher's employee ID he didn't recognize offhand, though the name attached to it was one he'd hired himself 6 months back. A quiet kid out of Lafayette who'd never given him a reason to double-check his work. Whatever had happened, it hadn't happened by accident, and it hadn't happened without somebody inside his own company signing off on it. Ezra leaned over his shoulder, reading the screen without asking permission. That's not possible. Nobody touches routing without you signing off. Somebody did. Roscoe's jaw was tight now. A different kind of stillness than the one at the shed. Bridge maintenance. That's the reroute reason listed. Bridge maintenance on the interstate that doesn't exist on any county schedule I've ever seen. Odessa watched him do the math out loud, watched the pieces land one after another across his face. The call that came too fast, the answer that was too rehearsed. A schedule and a route that both pointed to the same two-lane stretch of blacktop, the one that ran straight past a private spillway. Somebody had gone to a lot of trouble to keep quiet. Gil's voice had dropped to almost nothing. Roscoe, who assigned this run? Roscoe looked up from the screen, past all of them, toward the dark shape of the levee, where the mechanical hum hadn't stopped once since they'd arrived. Nobody asked me to drive this route, he said. Somebody put me on it. Roscoe stood there a long moment, with the phone still in his hand, not looking at the screen anymore, looking at nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into a register none of them had heard from him all night. Vachon, he said. Roland Vachon. 10 years of trying not to say that name out loud sat behind it, plain in how long it took him to get the second word out. 10 years ago, I stood in a courtroom in Baton Rouge and testified about a bridge deck on Route 415 that buckled under floodwater the parish had been warned about for 3 years running. I was hauling steel across it twice a week back then. I saw the cracking before anybody official admitted it existed. When it finally gave way, 6 people didn't make it off that bridge in time. He paused, jaw tight. Vachon's construction company built the original deck. His lawyers spent 4 years making sure the word negligence never once made it into a verdict. Odessa's breath had stopped somewhere in her chest, her whole body locked on the sound of that name. One of the 6, Roscoe said, and he had to stop and look down at his own hands before he could finish, was a flagger working the shoulder that morning, directing traffic away from the section that was already failing. I read her name into the record myself, because nobody else would say it clearly enough for the court reporter to get it right the first time. He looked at her now, really looked, the way he'd looked at her back at the trucks when she first said the number 240. Marguerite Renfro. Odessa said the name back to him, quiet, flat, the way you confirm something you've spent your whole life not being able to prove. That was my mother. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The mechanical hum from the spillway kept ticking upward behind them, patient, indifferent, the only sound that hadn't changed. Odessa's hands had curled into fists at her sides without her noticing. 3 years of nobody in this parish saying her mother's name out loud, and now a stranger with a company jacket had said it plainer than anyone at the funeral ever had. They told us it was an accident, she said. The county sent a letter, 1 page. It said equipment failure. Like the bridge just got tired and gave up on its own. It wasn't equipment failure. Roscoe closed the last of the distance between them, close enough now that she had to tilt her head back to hold his eyes. It was a load rating nobody updated after 3 flood seasons wore down a support nobody inspected. I said as much under oath. Vachon's lawyers called it an act of God, in front of a jury that wanted to believe them more than they wanted to believe a truck driver. I never learned your name, he said, quieter now. I had a case file with 6 names in it, and I never once wondered what happened to the families after the verdict came down wrong. I told myself that wasn't my job. My job was telling the truth on the stand and going home. He shook his head slowly. I didn't go looking for you. I didn't go looking for any of them. You're looking now, Odessa said. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even close to it. Neither of them had expected to be standing in the middle of a floodplain, saying any of this to each other at 3 in the morning. Roscoe's hands, clenched since the phone call with Arsenault, finally came unclenched at his sides. He let out a breath that had clearly been held a lot longer than the last 5 minutes. His jaw set again a moment later, the softness in his face gone as quick as it came. This isn't about a schedule anymore, he said. Vachon spent a decade making sure that courtrooms stayed closed. Then a route gets reassigned 2 days ago that nobody on my end approved, funneling my trucks, and the one witness who could still hurt him down a 2-lane road that feeds straight into his private spillway. He was already moving, faster now, back toward the shed where his phone still had signal. That's not weather. That's not an accident. Somebody wanted this convoy on this road tonight, and somebody at my own company made sure it happened. Ezra caught up to him. You think somebody sold the route? I think somebody got paid to put us here, Roscoe said. And I think Arsenault's not the only one who already knew whose truck was coming down 990 tonight. He pulled up his contacts and scrolled past every number that led back through the parish. Past every office that answered to a county budget Vachon had spent a decade greasing. He stopped on a name from a different world entirely, State Police Barracks in Port Allen, a captain who'd worked cargo theft cases with Pruitt Freight for 15 years and owed Roscoe more favors than either of them had bothered counting. "Odell," Roscoe said when the line connected, already walking back toward the levee, Odessa and Ezra falling into step behind him. "I need Iberville deputies who don't drink at Vachon's Marina, and I need them at Coldwater Bend in 15 minutes. Somebody just tried to drown 11 trucks and call it weather." Back at the convoy, Roscoe laid it out fast and flat, no room left for debate. 6 drivers reversed their rigs off the low road within minutes, engines grinding backward through the fog toward the bypass, taking the safest 6 trucks and the least risk with them. Nobody blamed them for it. A man with a family waiting on him had no obligation to stand on a levee at 3 in the morning for a stranger's fight. 5 stayed. Gil parked his rig broadside across the shoulder, headlights aimed straight at the levee like search beams, and didn't ask permission. The other 4 lined up beside him the same way, until the whole stretch of blacktop above the spillway was lit up bright as a stage. "You go do what you need to do," Gil said, climbing back down from his cab long enough to catch Roscoe before he started up the levee. "We'll hold this light on that water till the sun comes up, if that's what it takes." It wasn't an apology for the parking lot, not in so many words, but it didn't need to be one. Roscoe just nodded and kept walking. "Clock's still running," Roscoe said, checking his phone one more time before he shoved it back in his pocket. 2:28, 12 minutes to the number Odessa had carried 3 miles barefoot to give them. The remote switch is one thing, the manual wheel is another. Even if Vachon's crew flips that override again, somebody standing at the physical crank can still open those gates by hand. We need eyes on it before he gets the chance. They climbed the access ladder together, Roscoe first, then Odessa, then Ezra bringing up the rear, with the flashlight angled low, so the beam wouldn't announce them before they were ready. The rain had thinned to a mist that clung to everything, cold and fine, beating on the rusted rungs under their hands. If you've ever climbed towards something you were scared of, because walking away would have cost more than the fear, you already understand what this next 12 minutes is going to feel like. Hit subscribe now, because what's waiting at the top of this ladder is the man this whole night has been circling. At the top, the levee flattened into a narrow concrete walkway running along the spillway's edge, the water below churning louder here than it had anywhere else, close enough to taste the mineral cold coming off it. Ezra's flashlight swept the walkway once, twice, and on the third pass caught a shape standing at the far end, hunched over a rusted iron wheel taller than he was. Roland Vachon didn't run. He didn't even flinch at the light. He stood there soaked to the waist, one hand still resting on the crank, breathing hard enough that Odessa could hear it over the water from 30 feet away. "You don't understand what this project means," Vachon said, not turning around, the sentence coming out rehearsed, worn smooth from however many times he'd said it to himself in the last 12 minutes. "That marina is everything I have left. Every dollar I own is poured into that foundation, and it doesn't survive another flood season without this release tonight. That bridge investigation stayed closed for 10 years because people like you made sure of it," Roscoe said, stepping onto the walkway, Odessa and Ezra close behind him. "You don't get to flood a road to protect a marina and call it bad luck. It should have stayed closed." Vachon's grip tightened on the crank instead of releasing it. That case was over. Settled. Then some driver goes and testifies about a load rating nobody asked him about, and 10 years later, I'm still paying lawyers to keep my name off the front page every time somebody mentions that bridge. 6 people died on that bridge, Roscoe said. One of them raised this girl. Vachon's hand stopped on the crank, not turning it, not releasing it either. He turned, slowly, and his flashlight-lit face found Odessa's. Really found it, taking in the canvas coat and the bare feet, and the eyes that belonged, unmistakably, to a woman he'd spent a decade trying to forget. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. His hand slid an inch down the crank, not turning it, just holding on to something solid, while the rest of him seemed to come apart in real time. Behind them, far down the levee road, the darkness split open, blue and red light sweeping across the water in slow, steady arcs, still a distance off but closing fast. cutting through the mist toward Coldwater Bend. The gate hadn't stopped yet. Help was coming, but Vachon's hand was still on the wheel. Vachon's hand hadn't come off the crank yet, but it had stopped fighting for it. He was talking now, fast, the words spilling out of him in the disordered way of a man trying to explain himself before someone else got the chance to explain him first. The marina was never just about the marina, he said. You think I sank $11 million into a foundation because I love boats. That investigation reopening means depositions. Depositions mean my name back in a courtroom, and this time, there's no verdict left to buy. I needed this section flooded and gone before anybody with a subpoena came looking for what's underneath it. Underneath it, Roscoe repeated, and he stopped walking for a second, one hand flat against the cold rail of the ladder behind him. What's underneath it, Vachon? Vachon didn't answer that. He didn't have to. The silence did the confessing for him. You didn't need a flood tonight, Roscoe said. You needed a flood with witnesses gone before sunrise. That's why my trucks are on this road instead of the interstate. Somebody at my own company sold you the route. $4,000, Vachon said, and for a man about to lose everything, his voice had gone almost businesslike, reciting a figure the way you'd read a receipt. That's what it cost me, to put 11 trucks exactly where I needed them, at exactly the hour I needed them there. Cheaper than the lawyers would have been. Ezra's jaw worked, but he didn't say anything. Odessa watched Roscoe's face while the number sank in. No reaction she could name, just his eyes going flat and precise. The same look he'd had reading the panel back at the shed. Marguerite Renfro, Roscoe said, and this time it landed as a verdict, not a memory. Vachon's hand slid off the crank entirely. That was the whole confession, more honest than anything he'd said out loud in the last 10 minutes. He stood there with both hands empty at his sides, soaked through, looking past Roscoe at nothing, because there was nowhere left to run to. Behind them, the blue and red light that had been sweeping the water in slow arcs sharpened into headlights, engines, doors slamming, boots on wet concrete. 3 state police cruisers came up the levee road fast, followed by a 4th carrying Sheriff Wendell Toops, a man who'd spent 30 years watching Vachon buy his way around Iberville Parish and had finally been handed the paperwork to end it. Captain Odell Fontenot was first out of his car, already reaching for his radio before his boots hit the ground. "Cut the gates," Roscoe called to him. "Manual override. 3rd switch from the left. There's a laptop running it from a truck in the trees behind the shed." Fontenot didn't ask questions. 2 deputies were already moving toward the tree line, while a 3rd climbed the ladder to secure the crank Vachon had just let go of. The hum from the spillway shuddered, stuttered, and dropped into silence for the first time since the convoy had reached Coldwater Bend. Sheriff Toops walked straight past Vachon toward Roscoe instead, badge catching the cruiser lights. "We picked up Denise Arsenault 20 minutes ago at the parish office. Found a 2nd cell phone in her desk drawer, one that never touched the county system. Every call she made rerouting your convoy is sitting on it." He glanced toward Vachon, being cuffed now by 2 deputies who didn't bother being gentle about it. "And we've got a dispatcher out of Lafayette on the way in voluntarily. Boy called it in himself an hour ago. Said he couldn't sleep on what he'd taken money for." $4,000 buys a lot of sleepless nights, Roscoe said, watching the deputies walk Vachon toward the cruiser. "It bought him a route," Toops said. "It didn't buy him a conscience. That's the part these men never plan for." Roscoe let out a long breath, shoulders dropping half an inch, though the number on his phone still read 239. Vachon didn't fight the cuffs. As the deputies walked him past Roscoe toward the cruiser, he stopped for one step, just long enough to look at Odessa. "You think $4,000 is the first time I've bought my way around a problem," he said, low enough that only the people closest to him caught it. 10 years ago it was lawyers instead of a dispatcher. Different price, same idea. It's just the first time anybody's actually caught me at it. Nobody answered him. The deputies moved him forward before Roscoe could say a word, and the cruiser door shut on whatever else he might have said. Overhead, the sky above Coldwater Bend had started turning the flat gray of early morning, the kind of light that doesn't announce itself so much as arrive. The bridge was still standing. The water below it had stopped rising the moment the gates went dark. 11 trucks sat idling half a mile back, with their lights still burning uselessly, into a danger that no longer existed. The night was over. What Vachon had left hanging in the air on his way to the cruiser wasn't. Nobody filmed the morning after. Sheriff Toops drove Odessa back to the boat ramp so she could gather the milk crate of paperback books she called her only furniture, and found half the convoy already there ahead of him, loading her few belongings into the cab of Roscoe's truck without being asked. Gil carried the crate himself and didn't say a word about it, which was its own kind of apology for a parking lot conversation neither of them ever brought up again. No cameras, no crowd, just a handful of tired men doing the one thing that actually mattered before the sun was even fully up. Everything after that moved fast. Once the state police had Vachon's laptop and Arsenault's second phone in hand, prosecutors in Baton Rouge didn't wait long to reopen the Route 415 file, this time setting Roscoe's decade-old testimony next to a fresh trail of evidence that the same man had worked to bury the truth on 2 separate occasions, 10 years apart, using whatever tool was cheapest at the time. Arsenault turned in her resignation before the council could schedule a vote on it. Bayou Crest never broke ground again. The half-finished marina sat abandoned at the edge of the property Vachon no longer owned, slowly losing ground to the same river he'd tried to turn into a weapon. 3 weeks later, a crowd gathered at Coldwater Bend that wouldn't have shown up for Odessa a month earlier. Truckers who'd only known her for one long night. Neighbors who'd spent 3 years stepping around her without a second look. The parish council bolted a new sign to the rail where the rusted one had hung for decades. Roscoe stood next to her while the mayor read the name out loud for the crowd. Marguerite Renfro Bridge. There was more waiting past the ceremony. The council put together emergency housing support, split between county funds, and a matching pledge from Pruitt Freight Lines. Roscoe added one more thing on his own, no announcement attached to it. An open seat in his dispatch office for anyone willing to learn the job instead of sleeping rough. Odessa started that Monday, wearing a pair of shoes that actually fit, at a desk, with a window that looked straight out over Highway 990. Nobody owed her an apology anymore, and none of them tried to pay her one. What she needed was steadier than that. 3 years of nothing holding, and now something finally did. Standing at the rail during the ceremony, she ran her fingers across her mother's name in fresh paint, watching water that had almost swallowed 11 more lives the same way it had already taken one. What came out of her wasn't the careful, contained crying she'd taught herself under a bridge for 3 years. It came out loud, and it didn't stop for a while, the way it only can once a person finally has somewhere safe enough to let it. Roscoe didn't try to talk over it. He kept one hand on her shoulder until she was ready, then told her the truck was running whenever she wanted to head home. That's the story. A homeless girl warned 11 strangers who had no reason to believe her, and every one of them made it home because she refused to stop talking. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Who's the Odessa in your town? The person everybody drives past, holding on to something true that nobody's willing to hear? Tell me in the comments. Somebody like her is out there right now, and somewhere tonight, a stranger is deciding whether to actually stop. If this story stuck with you, pass it along to someone who needs it today. And if you haven't already, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Stories like this one deserve more room than they usually get. Picture standing where she stood that night. No home behind you, no family waiting, an entire town that already decided who you were before you opened your mouth, and you still run 3 miles barefoot to save 11 people who never gave you a reason to.